in the current situation of the world, pretty much the whole world being in kind of lockdown, we know that certain tech firms have been working on contact tracing technology to try and help people work out who they've been in contact with. So we've got Steve and Mike here. Steve, what's the deal here?
With the obvious medical situation at the moment, I'm not going to use the C word because we'll probably get demonetised and things if we do. There's a lot of talk about how we could use technology to sort of try and trace people who may have it and who they've been in contact with. And I thought it was interesting, particularly as Apple and Google have been working on technology to do this, to just have a conversation about this. I mean, it's sort of an interesting application of technologies that exist on the phone. I mean, if you were to sit and think about how you would do this then and understood the technology, then you'd come up with pretty much the same approach that Apple and Google have come up with. But the idea is that I'm walking along the street, Mike walks past me, my phone and his phone talk to each other, and then later Mike goes down with some sort of nasty disease. He notifies the phone, which notifies the local health service, and then that can tell me that I've just been infected by someone, hopefully preserving privacy. And then I can then go into self-isolation so that if I develop it, I don't pass it on to anyone else. That's the general idea. Some sort of automated way so that if someone suddenly finds out that they've become infected because they start to show symptoms, they can notify the people they may have been in contact, both the ones they know, but also the ones they've met in the aisle at Sainsbury's as they're picking up the baked beans, or wherever it is they might be. So it's a way of sort of keeping track of that in an easy way.
So sounds like you've sort of hit the nail on the head there. This is kind of, it's tracking what people are doing, but then you've got to somehow preserve privacy. Maybe that's a point to bring Mike in on this. Surely that's like the two sides of one coin, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the privacy is a real problem. In the sense that, and I mean, I should say that actually I'm not against this app or any of these apps in general. I think obviously trying to prevent the spread of a disease is obviously a good thing to do. I think that we should probably separate what in our heads would be a perfect system from what a system that might actually exist is. The issue with privacy is that, so Google and Apple's approach is, fairly private in the sense that you don't give away who you are, you just give away keys, and maybe we can talk about that in a moment. And it means that you can be told that you are in contact with someone who maybe has tested positive for this disease, but you probably can't find out necessarily who that is. But even that system isn't completely private. I mean, if lockdown was eased up a little bit and I went round to Steve's house for half a day, and then I get a message later on my phone that says someone on that day that you were in contact with has been exposed to some virus, well, it's not going to take great deductive reasoning for me to work out who that was. So it is private, but only to an extent. Right? There are ways around this.
There are some conundrums around it, but should we talk about, in hypothetically or in principle, how might something like this work?
Yes, I mean, the approach that they're taking, that Google and Apple are suggesting we take, and all the other approaches that are being taken are relatively straightforward. I mean, most of us carry around with us these days some form of smartphone, either an Android phone or an iPhone, whatever it is that takes your fancy. And these come with Bluetooth built in. And one of the features, particularly of Bluetooth for Bluetooth Low Energy that they offer, is the ability for low-power devices to sort of sit around the environment and transmit to say that they are there. So Apple have used this with their iBeacons technology. Other places have used this so that if you walk into a shop, that can then say to your phone, you're in Marks and Spencer's or wherever it is, and then that can bring up information on your phone relevant to the local area. So you can do sort of hyper-localized things. You could use it in your house so that if you say to your phone, turn on the lights, it knows which room you're in and turns on the right set of lights rather than having to say, turn on the lights in the lounge or whatever it is. The approach that they're taking is that they take this technology and make all phones regularly, say every 5 minutes, send out an advertisement with a specific code in it that says, this is for exposure tracing. So your phone will send something out, and then all the other phones in the area will receive that, and they know they've seen that phone. I've got a little demonstration set up using a Raspberry Pi here. This Raspberry Pi is actually sending out advertisements, not of the exposure tracing type, but just generic advertisements using some of the free software that came with Blues on Linux. And I've got my phone here running an app which can show you what things can be seen at the moment. So if I look at this at the moment, we can see down here at the bottom that, as well as seeing all my devices, there's one called Happy, which is what happens to be the name of that Raspberry Pi. And alongside that, in very small letters, it tells us the RSSI. Effectively, it's a sort of proxy for how far away that device is. So at the moment, it's showing that as being -42. If I move the device over here, it's gone to -60. As well as seeing that device is in the same room, we can also get some sort of idea of how far away it is from the person, which means that we can also say, well, actually, if it's too far away, then they're not likely to have been in close enough contact to have caught the virus. And so we'll just ignore that, because I mean, imagine you're walking down a street, you may well have line of sight to someone on the other side of the road, and so you won't necessarily pick anything up from that. So there's no point in recording that. On the other hand, if I'm sitting on the bus next to someone, then you would definitely want to know about that, because the chances are. It's a little tricky, because if you hold the phone in different directions, it's in your back pocket, and the other person's back pocket, you'll get different types of sort of readings off there, but you get some sort of sense. So that can tell us what's in the same area. And the idea that Google and Apple are saying is, okay, every time we get one of those advertisements, we note down who it is. And we can build up a big table on the phone that says, I have seen this phone at this time, and you can then extend it if you see it 5 minutes later and so on. You can get an idea of who you've seen and for how long you've been exposed to them. A brief fleeting glimpse as you walk past someone on the street, you probably will never get picked up and never recorded. Being in the same shop for 10 minutes while you're doing your shopping probably will get recorded and things. That's the sort of thing you want to know, because that fleeting glance as you walk past, probably not going to pass anything on at all. Now, you need to do some way of knowing who that is. So you could just give everyone in the world a number. I would be number 6, you could be number 12, Mike could be number 2.
I'd be number 1.
That sort of thing. But the problem with that is then it becomes very easy to say who's been in contact with who. And you don't really need that information to contact trace, to detect exposure as a way of doing this. You just need to know that A's been in contact to B. The other thing that Apple and Google have suggested is a way of anonymizing this, so that I know I've been exposed to someone, but I don't know who it is, and there really isn't an easy way without other information. I was on this bus at this time and so on, to actually de-anonymize it.
As I see it, it's a bit like sonar or radar with a bit more information. So, you know, you've got these, a bit like transponders on planes, where everybody has some kind of number, and you can say, okay, you met number 2, number 3, you went past number 1, but it wasn't very close, etc., etc. Have I got that about right?
That's right. You know who everyone is, they're in the same area, you've got a record that they were in the same area, and then if number 6 gets some particular weird thing, you can then broadcast out to everyone else, this identifier had this, and then they can check their databases, or you could upload the databases into a central place, and they could then say to each other, you've been exposed, you probably should go into self-isolation or something for whatever the requirement is for the particular malady that is being traced at that point, and so on.
That makes me think people are going to be worried about these numbers and how we work out who's what number. So, Mike, how are people going to work out who these numbers are without telling people who they are and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so actually it's quite simple, and it's quite a clever way of doing it. We don't obviously send any individual identifiers out, right? It's just your phone is sending messages, but they're not messages that can be used to identify you. So, I mean, to use a very simple example, let's imagine that our applications were just sending out our names. Then you could just use any phone to sniff on anyone walking past that day, right? Which is probably an invasion of privacy, right? So, what we do instead is your phone will, every 24 hours, generate something called a temporary exposure key. And that is essentially a secret key that you're going to keep, and you're only ever going to send it out if you get diagnosed with some virus that you want to notify people about. So from that key, you combine that with the current time in a sort of rolling window of about 10 minutes. And every sort of 10 or 15 minutes, you'll take your temporary exposure key and the current time, and you'll combine them using encryption into your actual rolling proximity identifier, or RPI. And that thing is the thing you actually transmit out using this Bluetooth. What will happen is you'll be out and about, and you'll just get sent random rolling proximity identifiers, which are just meaningless numbers, and you can then stash them away on your phone for a later date. Now, let's imagine that I'm going out and about and I've created some of these rolling proximity identifiers. What happens if I go to a doctor and I get the disease, and I have to notify people who I've been in contact with. What I do is I upload to the cloud or up to the health authority or whoever it is that's running the app. I upload my temporary exposure keys, the daily keys that I was using. And then everyone else's phones will occasionally go up to the cloud and ask for any temporary exposure keys that have been released that day or for the last few days. And they will use those to generate, given the time that those were released, the different potential rolling identifier keys or rolling proximity identifiers that could have occurred based on that temporary exposure key. And if one matches, then your phone now knows that you've been exposed theoretically to some disease by being in Bluetooth contact with someone who has now sort of said, I've got it. Right? So what you actually basically get is a bunch of meaningless numbers, but once you get these temporary exposure keys from a sort of reputable source, your phone can sort of back calculate what those RPIs would have been and go, oh, actually, I did see that one. That means I've probably been exposed. Now, in the Google and Apple model, this is a decentralized process. So a decision as to whether to alert you or something like this is going to be made on your phone based on, for example, the signal strength, which is included in the packet, and things like how long you're in contact with them for and stuff like this. Other sort of, other health services and other companies and governments and things are working on slightly different systems which are centralized by design, which would have that kind of decision put into the cloud with many more people involved.
Computationally, isn't that really quite expensive? I mean, if you're potentially looking through trying to calculate, I'm guessing what will be kind of like a hash on every possible timestamp that your phone has been there on every possible released. Is that, am I right there?
So I mean, if you think that the for the current pandemic, the sort of suggestion is that maybe you're contagious for maybe 14 days. So you're not going to bother releasing all of your temporary exposure keys that you've ever produced, right? If you've been running this app for a year. So you get diagnosed, you release, let's say, a maximum of 14 of these keys. There's 144 of these 10 or 15 minute windows in a day. So you've got that 14 times that many possible encryptions that you've got to perform per key, right? So it is an issue computationally, but it's not a disaster, right? And you're only going to do it once per key. Either you've seen it or you haven't. And so, it's doable, right? But this is going to be an overhead. There is going to be an overhead involved in doing this. You only have to work out whether it's worth alerting the user if you find the key. So, you download the temporary exposure key, you perform the encryption, you generate the potential RPIs, and you compare them with the ones you've seen. And if you get a hit, that's when you start looking in a more complicated way at things like signal strength and things like this. So you don't do all that unless you've got this cryptographic hit and you said, okay, I actually was connected to that phone at least briefly.
And there's other things you can do, of course. For example, if you decide that exposure of less than, say, 5 minutes isn't harmful, let's say that for some reason you need to be exposed for 15 minutes within 2 meters, you can already start to throw away that data on your local device if you know that that's not the case. You know that I've only seen this identifier for 3 minutes. I guess there's an issue. It may have changed midway through that, but you've only seen it for 3 minutes. Then I'm not going to be needing this. I can throw it away and things and so on. You've also got data on the...
There's a limit to how much data you have to be able to hold on to at the same time, right? It's not none, but it's not... And these are small messages. I mean, these are sort of 16-byte messages. So, it's not a huge amount of memory either.
I mean, every text message you send is going to be bigger than this. And if we think about the way some people text, every email is going to be massively bigger than this. I mean, a text message will be at least 10 times bigger than this. An email probably 100 times bigger than this just in the headers and things. So it's really small amounts of data.
I think I was worried that if I'm thinking of every possible time in every possible day and then trying to calculate a hash based upon a potential of however many thousand keys released in it. Do you see what I mean? I was more thinking of if I've got to be making those, it's not the same as going, right, okay, over this period of time, did I see number 6, number 2, and number 3? It's actually, did I see number 6 hashed with the time?
Yeah, so there is an additional amount of work because you've got to take that temporary exposure key and combine it with all the different possible times that key was, because each key comes with a sort of approximate day that it was active, and so you've got maybe 144 different encryptions you're going to have to perform. Obviously, you're only receiving new exposure keys from the cloud. So maybe 10 people have used the app that day, and so you've only got 10 of these to do. But then maybe 1 million people have used the app and been diagnosed that day. It's not been a good one. And now you've got a lot more encryption you've got to do.
But again, you've also got extra data that, so you can sort of, the phone knows where it's been location-wise, so it can start to give, say, this one never left Liverpool, or this one never left Balamory or somewhere.
The Google and Apple model, what they're doing is they're releasing an API which will allow you to do these things, this Bluetooth message passing and this key generation on the device. But they're not providing an app that will do contact tracing or any kind of public service, public health announcements or anything like that. What they're assuming is that countries or the NHS or some other hospital will implement a system like this and use this API. So actually, there isn't very much information held in these messages. All you get is, someone has been diagnosed or reportedly been diagnosed with this virus, and you were in contact with them for this window of time because of this Bluetooth signal. What do you do, right? That's a very good question. I get a message on my phone that says someone has been exposed to some virus and you've had a brief amount of contact with them, but you don't know who it is or where this was. It's impossible to know whether I should be self-quarantining or not, right? I mean, maybe it's gone through a wall and it was just, a neighbour or something like that, and I've not actually had any physical contact with them. Without more information, it's nice and private in some sense. It's difficult to trace where everyone's been going and with whom, but it's difficult to get a big picture of what's going on with the spread of a pandemic or something like this, which is why some countries are looking for slightly more information, like GPS locations and actual names and addresses and contact with GPs and things like this, to build a much bigger picture of what's going on. And that's where I think people start to decide, how much privacy should we be giving away even temporarily for something like this. But yes, so some governments have said basically, if we're going to do proper contact tracing, we want more information than this, right? We would like GPS, we'd like who your family members are, this is the same kind of contact tracing they would do anyway, right? If I got a disease that needed to be traced, they would ask me personally who I'd been in contact with. I'd tell them and they'd phone them up and ask them as well, right? So in some sense, what they're building into the additional information they're building into these applications isn't anything we're not kind of already doing. But this is all automated, and we're kind of working on the assumption that this goes away at the end of this pandemic. I don't know. I'm kind of undecided, but I think that some people are not so sure about this.
One way to look at this is that there's two ways of doing it. What Apple and what will traditionally be doing if you want to do exposure tracing is, someone's infected, you then go and ask them who have you been in contact with, and then you go and ask who they've been in contact with. So you collect that data when you need it. The alternative approach is you collect all the data so that if you need it, you can find what you want easily. And it's that difference between approach. If you've got all the data, you can probably get better quality out of it, but do you need that data? What are the privacy, GDPR implications about that you need to take into account? Will that then put people off using it? So some people will be more happy to use one which is relatively low, kept to their own device. There's some risk to it, but other people will say, no, I wouldn't use that at all. Whereas one where the government's effectively collecting data of everywhere you've been may put more people off, at which point, as you say, you've then got actual less data, because people say, well, I'm not putting that on my phone. And if enough people do that, you may end up with a system that should be better, but will actually perform worse, because it's actually collecting less data. There's more people walking around getting infected and passing the infection on that you have no knowledge about. So that's the problem. I mean, either system's open for abuse. I mean, we've seen people pranking Apple Maps and Google Maps' transport data by strapping phones to dogs. And so we could have sort of robot dogs running around the sort of country broadcasting that they are a person with a key, and then people say afterwards they'll go and mark them as infected. So there needs to be some sort of controls, because you could imagine causing chaos. You could sort of send a little drone around flying over the heads of large parks, broadcasting infection messages, and then tip it off. So you need to be able to verify this before that gets in.
Steve, there are enough conspiracy theories doing the rounds already. Let's not add to
Yeah, you don't need to use 5G for this. It works perfectly well on 2G.
Steve makes a valid point, which is that any system implementing this kind of contact tracing has got to be very well programmed, because, I mean, hypothetically, I secrete my phone somewhere near the checkout of a supermarket. I get contact with dozens, hundreds of people throughout the day, and then I report that I've got some virus, right? And then suddenly they're all getting these things. Now, obviously, I've got no real reason to do that, but we can't assume that everyone's going to use the system exactly how we intended it to be used, right? So you're going to have to build in probably some kind of actual medical check, right, which has got to be tied into a health service of some kind. And this all adds delays. It does get quite complicated quite quickly.
The thing is about this is it really requires pretty much 100% involvement. People have to buy into this. You have to get everybody who's a smartphone to buy into this, or it's not going to work properly. What if only 20% of people had it, Steve?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the thing. The first thing to remember in mind is even if you've got 100%, it may not work because you're still relying on people to self-isolate when they're told to and things and so on. But obviously, as less people are using it, you're going to catch less interactions between people as they move around. If 10% of your population aren't using it because they don't have a smartphone or they don't like the privacy implications of what's there. Now, in some ways, that possibly wouldn't be too bad because you'd probably catch the second order effect of that, okay, Dave's a refusenik, he doesn't take his smartphone out when he goes shopping, he gets infected, he passes it on to Mike, who he bumps into in the sort of Tesco round the corner. Mike does use it though, he then gets ill, and everyone Mike's been in contact with gets notified, and so you've lost one level, but of course if you then if Mike then becomes a refusenik because he doesn't like the security implications of what the particular app's being used, you've now got 3 levels before you get things. And so you can start to see that actually as more people don't use it, you get more problems with coming on. So the more people using it, the better it's going to be work. So you want a system that gets as many people to use it here. And I suspect if you were to model these things, and I'm not an epidemiologist, it's not my sort of field, you'd find that actually having less information but more people using it, there's going to be a balance to be found between, do you have more people using it with more information? At some point, one is going to be better than the other, and it's trying to model what that is going to be. I think is going to be an interesting question for people who are developing these apps, the societies they're running in, and what they offer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone knows right at the moment. I think the benefit of the Google and Apple approach is that it's quite low power, and it just sort of sits on the operating system and eventually will be app free. So you won't need to necessarily have an app installed for this API to exist. And that means that the uptake per device will be quite high for the compatible devices and for the people that have, sufficiently powerful smartphones. For the slightly more involved apps, there's big questions over if they start using too much battery because they're polling GPS or too much Bluetooth or something like this, or constantly reporting to the cloud. If you take a 20% battery hit per day, it's not going to be long before you give up and uninstall. And that drives down the amount of use, which is exactly what we don't want, right? So, there are questions over, could you mandate something, make this sort of mandatory? It's going to be difficult, right? People are not going to like that. I suppose it's theoretically possible. I think I read somewhere, and bear in mind, I can't remember what the source was, but it was something about 80% need to have this app installed and being used for it to be really effective. There'll be some measure of effectiveness below this. But if that's the case, it's got to be very fluid, very easy to use, and there's got to be a real sort of push for everyone to kind of do it as a public service, right? And, whether or not that happens, I'm not sure yet. Yeah,
I think there's an advantage in getting people to buy in. If you've got the big tech companies which have long, in particular certain cases, had a strong privacy advocation going on saying this is working, we want you to use it, you're going to get more buy-in there than if you come up with something random and you've got a lot of people that don't trust your government, for example, depending on what country you're in and things. So it's a sort of an interesting sort of management of what's going on there. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. Well,
thanks both for getting involved in this. Great to keep Computerphile going while we're remote, and hopefully my phone won't be pinging yours anytime soon.
See you later.
Bye.
One of the big downsides of Kerberos is that this is a bottleneck, and it's also a single big point of failure. We're all trusting that these keys are coming from this one place. If that place gets compromised...
Machine. So it'll send packet 1 over to the machine. That'll take some time to get there, but eventually it'll get there. And then it will send